There is a specific social experience that most people who have achieved something visible will recognize, and that almost nobody talks about honestly, because talking about it honestly requires admitting something that feels uncomfortably close to a complaint about success. You accomplish something real, something that required genuine effort, genuine sacrifice, genuine sustained commitment over a period of time when it would have been considerably easier to stop. And then, when it becomes visible, when other people can see it clearly, something unexpected happens. Not universal celebration, not simple admiration. Instead, a specific and uncomfortable shift in the atmosphere around you. Certain people who were warm before become subtly cooler. Certain people who seemed supportive begin asking questions with a pointed quality. Certain people begin noticing flaws in the achievement that they never mentioned in the work that preceded it, or flaws in you that apparently never bothered them before this particular moment, and you find yourself in the specific and bewildering position of someone who has done something they are genuinely proud of and who is experiencing, in response, a social environment that seems, in certain quarters, to have turned slightly against them. Not openly, not dramatically, but enough that you can feel it, in the faint edge in certain conversations, in the comments that land just a little harder than their surface content warrants, in the specific quality of enthusiasm that is conspicuously absent from certain people who should, by any reasonable measure, be pleased for you. The specific phenomenology of this experience is worth dwelling on before we move to the explanation, because getting clear about exactly what the experience consists of is part of what makes the explanation useful. It is not quite hostility. Open hostility is easier to manage because it is legible. You know what you are dealing with, and you can respond to it. What achievement generates is something murkier, something that presents itself on the surface as care or honesty or genuine concern, while carrying underneath that surface a specific charge that does not quite match its stated content. The comment that is technically a compliment, but leaves you feeling slightly diminished. The question that is technically curious, but carries the specific weight of a challenge. The suggestion, offered with apparent warmth, that you be careful, be humble, remember where you came from, that has, underneath its surface concern, the specific energetic quality of a hand pushing down rather than reaching across. This is what the shadow's projection looks like in social reality. Not a face it turns toward you, but a texture, a quality of pressure, a specific and unmistakable atmosphere that you learn to recognize once you understand what is generating it. Gustav Jung identified the mechanism underlying this dynamic with characteristic precision, and he located it in one of the most universal and most consistently misunderstood features of human social psychology. The mechanism is projection, specifically the projection of shadow material, and the trigger for this particular form of projection is something Jung observed across his clinical work with remarkable consistency. Visible perfection, visible achievement, visible happiness, the conspicuous embodiment of something that other people want, but do not yet have, activates in those people the specific shadow content that most urgently needs projection. And the target of that projection, the visibly successful person, becomes, without doing anything wrong, the carrier of someone else's denied inadequacy, denied ambition, or denied self-worth. This video is going to trace this dynamic from its psychological roots in Jung's theory of the shadow and projection, through Nietzsche's analysis of what he called the morality of the herd and the specific social punishment it reserves for those who distinguish themselves, through René Girard's extraordinarily precise theory of mimetic rivalry and the scapegoating mechanism, through the evolutionary biology of status competition and the specific social function of cutting the tall poppy down, through the rich mythological tradition that has encoded this pattern from the story of Joseph and his brothers to the myth of this Actaeon to the crucifixion narrative itself. And we will arrive, through all of this theoretical and mythological material at the specific, practically applicable wisdom that the competitor material we examined introduced under the name of the tiny flaw technique, an approach that Jung's own framework illuminates and explains with a depth that transforms it from a social tactic into a genuine piece of psychological wisdom about the management of one's own visibility and the protection of one's own energy in a world that has a complex and ambivalent relationship with the success of others. By the end, the hostile comment, the pointed question, the faint cooling of a previously warm relationship in the wake of your achievement will look different to you. Not less unpleasant, necessarily, but different. You will understand what it is actually made of, and that understanding will give you something considerably more useful than either distress or defensiveness, which is genuine freedom of response. Jung's theory of the shadow, which we have examined in other videos in this series, provides the foundational framework for understanding why visible success generates hostility. The shadow, in Jung's framework, is the repository of everything the conscious personality has decided does not belong to it. The qualities, desires, capabilities, and ambitions that were suppressed, denied, or simply never developed, because the social environment in which the person grew up did not make room for them. For the majority of people, the shadow contains not only genuinely dark or harmful material, but also an enormous quantity of unlived potential, suppressed ambition, unacknowledged capability, an unmet desire for precisely the kinds of achievement, recognition, or freedom that they observe in others. When a person who carries this positive shadow material, suppressed ambition, denied capability, unacknowledged desire for the same kind of success they are witnessing, encounters someone who has actually achieved what their own shadow is demanding of them, a specific and powerful psychological event occurs. The achievement in the other person does not simply inspire or motivate. It confronts the shadow directly, holding up an external, visible, undeniable form, exactly the thing that the shadow has been trying to bring to consciousness through the only channels available to it, which are envy, irritation, and the specific social hostility we are examining. The successful person has become, for the person experiencing this dynamic, an involuntary mirror of their own unlived life. And mirrors that show you something you are not ready to see tend to generate as their first response the impulse to break them. Jung documented this mechanism in considerable clinical detail across his case histories. He described patients who came to him not with complaints about their own achievements, but with complaints about specific people in their lives whose success seemed to produce in them an irrational and disproportionate negative response. Through the analytic process, Jung consistently found that the intensity of the negative response to another person's success was directly proportional to the degree to which the patient had suppressed their own desire for the same kind of success. The artist who had abandoned their creative work for a safer career and who found themselves filled with an inexplicable bitterness toward a former colleague whose work was now being celebrated. The professional who had taken the expected, conventional path and who experienced a colleague's unconventional success as somehow a personal affront. In each case, the hostility directed outward at the successful other was, on examination, the shadow's communication directed inward at the self. A message about unlived potential, suppressed desire, and the specific choices that had foreclosed the possibilities the other person had pursued. Understanding this does not make the hostility pleasant to receive, but it does make it considerably less personal and considerably more comprehensible than the unexamined experience of simply feeling attacked. This is the specific mechanism underlying what sociologists call the tall poppy syndrome, the documented tendency of certain social groups to cut down, undermine, or socially punish members who rise noticeably above the group's norm. The term comes from a story told about the ancient Roman king Tarquin, who, when asked how to manage the powerful men of a newly conquered city, said nothing but walked through a field and cut off the heads of the tallest poppies with his staff. The message was understood immediately. Eliminate whoever stands out. The mechanism operates not primarily through conscious malice, but through the specific dynamic Jung describes. The shadow material of the group finding its projection target in the person whose achievement most acutely confronts that material. The evolutionary biology of this dynamic adds an important dimension. Research on status competition in social species consistently finds that the detection of superior status in a conspecific, another member of the same species, and particularly one whose superior status is felt as directly relevant to one's own competitive position, activates a specific competitive threat response. In ancestral human groups, where resources were genuinely scarce and status directly determined access to those resources, the emergence of a clearly superior competitor was an actual, not merely symbolic, threat to one's own survival and reproductive prospects. The social hostility directed at the visibly successful person is, at its evolutionary root, a threat response, a defensive mobilization of competitive aggression against someone whose success constitutes, in the old biological calculus, a genuine competitive threat. The difficulty, as with so many evolutionary mechanisms operating in modern environments, is that the social circumstances in which this mechanism evolved are vastly different from the social circumstances in which most of us now live. In a modern context, your colleague's promotion, your friend's successful business, your neighbor's beautiful renovation, none of these constitute genuine competitive threats to your actual resources or your actual survival, but the same evolved threat assessment machinery that responded to the genuinely threatening alpha competitor in an ancestral group registers these modern status signals in the same ancient threat response framework, activating the same competitive hostility toward the person who has done something visibly impressive, simply because they have done something visibly impressive. Nietzsche's analysis of what he called herd morality provides the philosophical framework for understanding the specifically moral dimension of the hostility that achievement generates. Nietzsche observed that large groups of people who feel themselves unable to achieve at the level of their most capable members tend to develop a moral framework specifically designed to redefine their own incapacity as virtue and the capability of the exceptional individual as a form of moral deficiency. In this framework, ambition becomes selfishness. Achievement becomes showing off. Excellence becomes intimidating others. Standing out becomes failing to know your place. The moral language that herd morality uses to criticize the exceptional person is not arbitrary. It is specifically constructed to address the exact qualities that the exceptional person embodies and that the group's shadow most urgently needs to disown. The specific vocabulary of this moral critique is worth examining in detail because it is so consistent and so recognizable. Once you know what you are looking at, ambition becomes ruthlessness. Excellence becomes showing off. Independence becomes arrogance. Financial success becomes selling out. Creative success becomes commercialism. Physical transformation becomes vanity or an eating disorder. Intellectual distinction becomes thinking you are better than everyone. Emotional stability becomes not caring. Contentment becomes smugness. In every case, the specific quality being criticized is a quality the critic's shadow most urgently desires. And in every case, the critique is framed in moral language that allows the critic to position their own lack of the quality as a form of moral superiority rather than a simple absence. The person who has not achieved what you have achieved can, through the application of herd morality, transform this absence into a virtue and your achievement into a deficiency. They were not willing to be ruthless. They are too authentic to show off. They are too deeply connected to their community to become arrogant. The critique is a shadow management strategy, dressed in the language of values. Nietzsche did not present this analysis as a defense of arrogance, or as a dismissal on genuine community values. He was making a specific diagnostic observation about the psychology of resentment, specifically about the way that groups manage collective, shadow material through the construction of moral frameworks that pathologize what they cannot match. And his observation connects directly to what you experience when your achievement generates, in certain quarters, not celebration, but critique. The critique is often coded in exactly the moral language he described. Concerns about whether your success has changed you, whether you are becoming arrogant, whether you are still the same person, whether your achievement comes at someone else's expense. These are all legitimate questions in principle. But in the specific context of the tall poppy dynamic, they are typically not genuine inquiries. They are the moral vocabulary that the shadow uses to manage the confrontation with your achievement, without having to acknowledge what it is actually responding to. Girard's theory of mimetic desire and the scapegoating mechanism adds another layer of precision to this analysis. Girard observed that human desire is fundamentally mimetic, that we want what specific others want, that we use other people as models for what is worth desiring. And he further observed that when two or more people desire the same object or embody the same desire, they become, in the logic of mimetic desire, rivals. And the rival relationship has a specific, dangerous escalating quality that threatens the social fabric of any group that contains multiple rivals all pursuing the same desirable object. Groups have historically managed this threat. Girard argued through the scapegoating mechanism, the unconscious selection of a single figure onto whom the group's collective rivalrous tension is displaced and projected, allowing the group to achieve temporary cohesion through shared negative focus on the scapegoated individual rather than through continued internal rivalry. The figure most likely to be selected for this scapegoat role, Girard observed with uncomfortable precision, is very often someone whose success or distinction has most acutely activated the group's mimetic rivalry. The most successful member of a group is, in Girard's model, the group's most potent mimetic model, the person whose achievement most intensely activates everyone else's desire for the same thing. And this very quality, the quality of being someone others use as a model for what is worth desiring, is precisely what makes them the most available target for the group's need to discharge the rivalrous tension that the modeling has generated. Girard was careful to note that the scapegoating mechanism operates almost entirely below the level of conscious awareness. The members of the group who participate in it do not experience themselves as scapegoating. They experience themselves as responding to genuine flaws, genuine transgressions, genuine reasons why the targeted person deserves criticism or exclusion. The moral vocabulary that Nietzsche described, the herd morality that reframes competitive hostility as ethical concern, is precisely the cognitive structure that allows the scapegoating mechanism to operate while maintaining its own legitimacy in the eyes of those participating in it. This is why the targeted person so often finds themselves in the disorienting position of being unable to point to anything concrete they have done wrong while still experiencing a clear, palpable social pressure that functions as though they had. Read together, Jung, Nietzsche, and Girard provide a remarkably complete picture of why visible achievement generates hostility. The achievement activates shadow material in those who witness it, confronting them with their own suppressed ambition and unlived potential. The competitive threat response mobilizes ancient defensive aggression. The herd's moral framework translates this response into socially acceptable criticism, and the scapegoating mechanism provides a group-level vehicle for discharging the collective rivalrous tension the achievement has generated. None of this is personal. All of it is entirely predictable. And understanding it clearly and without the distortion of either hurt or defensiveness is the beginning of the only genuinely useful response. Mythology has encoded this pattern with remarkable fidelity across an enormous range of cultural traditions, which confirms that what we are describing is genuinely archetypal, woven into the deepest structures of human social experience, rather than being a modern or culturally specific phenomenon. The story of Joseph and his brothers, which we have discussed in earlier videos in this series, bears revisiting specifically in this context. Joseph's coat of many colors, given to him by his father, is the precise mythological symbol of visible distinction, of achievement and favor that cannot be hidden. It is this visibility, this unmistakable public marking of his exceptional status, that triggers in his brothers exactly the shadow activation, rivalrous hostility, and scapegoating impulse that Girard's model predicts. They do not harm him because they have examined his character and found it wanting. They harm him because his visible distinction confronts their own shadow, material about their own worth and their own standing in their father's eyes. And the most immediately available response to this confrontation is the attempt to eliminate the mirror. The myth of Actaeon, which we have also touched on in a different context, offers another image of the same principle from the divine rather than the human level. Actaeon, who glimpses the goddess Artemis bathing and is destroyed for it, is destroyed not for any moral failing, but simply for encountering something too perfect, too untouchable, too complete in its own excellence. The perfection cannot tolerate the direct witness of the merely mortal. This myth encodes, at the level of archetype, the specific dynamic that the achievement hostility pattern actualizes in everyday human life, the sense that visible perfection generates in those who encounter it, something closer to destruction than to celebration, not through the perfection's intention, but simply through the structural dynamics of the encounter, the crucifixion narrative, which Jung analyzed in depth as a mythological and psychological document, carries the same archetype in its most fully developed form. The story of Cain and Abel, which we have discussed in other contexts in this series, belongs in this company as well, specifically for what it reveals about the mechanism by which visible divine favor, the mark of distinction, activates in the observer exactly the shadow confrontation that Joseph's coat of many colors activated in his brothers. Abel's offering is accepted. Cain's is not. This difference in divine favor, this visible distinction between the brothers, is what triggers in Cain the specific rage that results in the first murder. The story does not present Cain as having been treated unjustly. It presents him as being unable to metabolize the confrontation with another person's superior favor, unable to contain the shadow response that the visible distinction activates, unable to perform the inner work of turning the envy and rage inward toward the examination of what they are pointing at, rather than outward toward the elimination of their trigger. The mark of Cain that follows is the mythological image of the permanent psychological cost of choosing, destruction over integration in the face of another person's achievement, the historical figure of Antonio Salieri, whose relationship to Mozart has been dramatized with great psychological insight in the play and film Amadeus, offers a real and richly documented case study of the same dynamic. Salieri was a genuinely accomplished composer by any ordinary standard. He was a court musician, widely respected, professionally successful. But his encounter with Mozart, with the specific quality of Mozart's genius, activated in him exactly the shadow mechanism we have been describing. Mozart's achievement confronted Salieri's shadow material with the specific, undeniable fact that the quality Salieri most desired, transcendent musical genius, was present in another person in a form so pure and so effortless that it rendered his. own respectable achievement suddenly inadequate in his own eyes. The historical and dramatic accounts of Salieri's response, whether fully accurate or partly mythologized, represent the specific cultural memory of the achievement hostility, dynamic in one of its most painful and most recognizable forms. The figure of Christ in this narrative is precisely the figure of absolute distinction, absolute goodness, absolute integrity, persecuted and ultimately destroyed by exactly the social mechanisms Girard describes, the scapegoating of the one whose perfection most acutely confronts the group's shadow material. Jung read the crucifixion not simply as a historical or theological event, but as a mythological map of what happens when the principle of absolute light, absolute distinction, absolute wholeness encounters the collective shadow's need for projection. The cross, in this reading, is the price of refusing to provide the group with the small, humanizing flaws that would have allowed them to contain their shadow response within manageable bounds. This brings us, finally and directly, to the practical wisdom encoded in the tiny flaw technique. The specific practice of deliberately introducing a small imperfection, a minor inconvenience, a touch of ordinary human difficulty into the presentation of one's achievement, precisely in order to give the shadow's projection mechanism somewhere less destructive to land. The competitor material we examined described this principle in practical terms with the example of the person who has acquired a beautiful historic apartment and who, rather than presenting it in its full undiluted magnificence, mentions the noisy neighbors, the old plumbing, the restrictions on renovation, the pipes that sometimes run rusty in the morning. This small inventory of imperfections does not diminish the achievement. It humanizes it. It provides the witnesses whose shadow material has been activated by the achievement's perfection with a small but sufficient gap through which to discharge the hostility before it becomes something more costly. Jung's own principle of the conjunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites, provides the theoretical foundation for understanding why this works. Jung observed consistently that the psyche, both individual and collective, requires balance between opposites, and that any extreme, any presentation of pure light without shadow, pure achievement without cost, pure success without difficulty, generates a compensatory movement toward the opposite extreme. The person who presents their achievement as entirely and unambiguously wonderful is, in Jung's framework, generating a psychic pressure in those who witness it that must find release somewhere. The tiny flaw provides the release valve. It reintroduces the necessary shadow into the light, the necessary cost into the achievement, the necessary human scale into what had threatened to become something too perfect for the ordinary human psyche to metabolize without defensive response. This is not dishonesty. It is not the performance of a false modesty that does not exist. It is something considerably more psychologically sophisticated, the deliberate inclusion of genuine shadow material that was always present, but that was in danger of being omitted from the presentation in a way that would have generated predictable and unnecessary social cost. Every genuine achievement has a cost. Every beautiful apartment has plumbing issues. Every great promotion has increased stress. Every transformation has the exhaustion and confusion that preceded it. Acknowledging these genuine imperfections is not diminishment. It is completion, the presentation of the full truth of the achievement rather than the edited, idealized version that activates the shadow's projective response. The Jungian concept of the persona, which we have examined extensively in other videos, connects here with particular precision. The persona that omits all shadow, that presents only achievement and success and ease, is not a stronger persona, but a more brittle one, more vulnerable to the specific kind of social attack we have been describing, precisely because its very completeness and invulnerability provides no human-scale gap through which the observer's shadow response can be metabolized. The person who presents themselves with appropriate humility, with genuine acknowledgement of difficulty and cost, with the small but real imperfections that every human life contains, has, in Jung's framework, integrated enough shadow into their persona to make it genuinely human scale, genuinely approachable, genuinely able to be metabolized by those around them without generating the defensive hostility that unrelieved perfection reliably produces. The specific practice of the tiny flaw technique deserves some concrete elaboration, because there is both a genuine and effective version of it and a poorly executed version that it produces the opposite of its intended effect. The genuine version involves identifying and sharing real imperfections, genuine costs, authentic difficulties associated with the achievement being presented, communicated with the same tone and in the same spirit as the achievement itself, not as false modesty, not as performance of humility, but as honest, complete accounting. The badly executed version involves either manufacturing imperfections that are not real, which registers as false and actually increases suspicion, or presenting the imperfections in a way that is so self-deprecating that it undermines the achievement entirely rather than humanizing it. The key to the genuine version is proportion and authenticity. The tiny flaw should be genuinely small relative to the achievement, real rather than invented, and communicated with a matter-of-fact equanimity of someone who has genuinely metabolized the difficulty rather than the anxious self-deprecation of someone who is performing humility they do not feel. A range of concrete examples illustrates what this looks like in practice across different kinds of achievement. The person who has lost a significant amount of weight and whose transformation is highly visible mentions to friends that they are still working on their relationship with certain foods and that the maintenance is harder than the loss was. The person who has just been promoted to a senior role mentions that the increased responsibility has meant significantly less time for the creative work they loved in their previous position. The person who has published a book mentions that the reviews have been mixed and that some of the critical responses have been harder to receive than they expected. The person who has built a successful business mentions the specific relationship or personal sacrifice that the building required. In each case, the tiny flaw is real, is proportionate, is communicated with equanimity rather than distress, and serves the specific function of providing the shadow's projection mechanism with a human-scale gap through which to discharge, rather than building up to the level of social hostility that unrelieved perfection generates. The person saying these things is not diminished by them. They are humanized, and that humanization is precisely the protection. A person who spends 20 minutes elaborating on the water pressure problems has overcorrected into the opposite excess and generated a different kind of social discomfort. There is a deeper and more personally important dimension to this practice that goes beyond the management of others' shadow responses, and it is worth dwelling on directly. The tiny flaw technique, properly understood, is not simply a social management strategy. It is a practice of psychological wholeness, the deliberate refusal to identify entirely with one's own achievements, the consistent maintenance of a perspective that sees the achievement in its full context of cost and imperfection, rather than only in its idealized, shadow-free form. Jung was deeply concerned throughout his clinical career with what he called inflation, the condition in which the ego becomes so identified with a particularly positive self-image, or with a particular role or achievement, that it loses contact with its own shadow material and with the ordinary human reality in which that shadow lives. Inflation produces not strength, but a specific and dangerous brittleness, a self-image so dependent on the continuation of the idealized self-picture that any shadow intrusion becomes a genuine threat to psychological stability rather than simply and flagging uncomfortable but manageable encounter with reality. The person who has genuinely integrated the tiny flaw into their own self-understanding, who carries their achievement alongside its genuine costs and imperfections rather than in a sanitized, shadow-free version, is not only more socially effective, but genuinely more psychologically stable, more resilient in the face of genuine difficulty, and more capable of the kind of continued growth that requires honest self-assessment rather than the maintenance of a polished persona. Active imagination, which Jung considered one of the most powerful tools available for shadow integration, can be applied specifically to this practice. In a quiet moment, allow yourself to imaginatively encounter your most significant recent achievement in its complete, unidealized form, including the exhaustion that preceded it, the doubts that accompanied it, the costs it exacted, the things you gave up or damaged in the pursuit of it, the ways in which it fell short of what you had originally imagined. This is not an exercise in diminishment. It is an exercise in completeness, in developing a relationship with the achievement that is strong enough to include its shadow without being threatened by it. The achievement that can contain its own shadow, that can be held in the mind alongside its costs and imperfections without losing its genuine value, is a considerably more stable psychological possession than the idealized version that requires continuous protection from shadow intrusion, shadow journaling applied specifically to the achievement hostility. Dynamic produces a different, but equally valuable insight. When you notice the specific social hostility that visible success generates in certain people around you, rather than responding primarily to the hostility itself, try directing your attention inward toward what the hostility is telling you about your own shadow material. What in your own history has made you particularly sensitive to this specific form of attack? What earlier experience does this current hostility recapitulate? What does the intensity of your own response to the hostility, whether hurt, anger, or the impulse to defend, tell you about where your own psychic investment in the achievement lies, and whether that investment has any shadow material mixed into it? These are not easy questions, but they are the questions that transform the unpleasant experience of achievement generated hostility from something that simply happens to you into something you can learn from and ultimately move through with greater genuine equanimity. The online dimension of this dynamic deserves specific attention because social media has amplified the achievement hostility mechanism in ways that make it considerably more intense and considerably more pervasive than its pre-digital form. When achievement was visible only to one's immediate social circle, the hostility it generated was contained within that circle's size and social reach. When achievement is visible to thousands or hundreds of thousands of people through a public post or a viral moment, the shadow activation occurs at a corresponding scale, producing a volume of hostile response that would have been structurally impossible before the architecture of contemporary social media made it available. The comment section of any post announcing a visible achievement, whether a significant weight loss, a published book, a business launch, or a public recognition of any kind, can be examined as a live demonstration of everything we have been discussing. The pointed questions, the concern trolling, the unsolicited cautions, the specific form of criticism that presents itself as honesty while carrying the unmistakable charge of shadow projection, all present in miniature form the exact dynamics that Jung, Nietzsche, and Girard each identified from their own very different analytical positions. The tiny flaw technique, introduced deliberately and authentically into the announcement itself, consistently reduces the volume and the intensity of this response. For exactly the reasons this video has been developing, the sixth and perhaps most fundamental practice is the cultivation of what might be called shadow-inclusive success, the deliberate development of a relationship to your own achievements that never omits the shadow dimension of cost, imperfection, and difficulty. This means, in practice, noticing when you are presenting your achievements in idealized, shadow-free form, and asking honestly why. Is it because the shadow dimension genuinely does not exist? Almost never. Is it because you are ashamed of the costs and imperfections? Possible and worth examining. Is it because you have not yet taken the time to genuinely integrate the shadow dimension into your experience of the achievement? Very often. And is it, sometimes, because the shadow-free presentation serves a social function of impressing or intimidating others that you have not yet honestly acknowledged to yourself? Also possible, and perhaps the most important version of this question to sit with, the person who has developed a genuine, integrated relationship with their own shadow material, who carries their achievements alongside their costs and their imperfections without either hiding the former or amplifying the latter, is not only more socially effective in navigating the hostile responses that visible success generates. They are more genuinely free. They are not dependent on the maintenance of a polished, idealized self-image for their sense of their own worth. They can weather attack without the specific kind of destabilization that comes from having invested too much of one's psychological stability in a persona from which all shadow has been carefully excluded. They can receive genuine criticism without it destroying them, because they already know their own flaws more intimately and more honestly than the critic does. And they can receive genuine praise without it inflating them, because they have not lost sight of the specific costs and imperfections that the praise tends to overlook. This is ultimately what Jung meant when he described the goal of individuation as the development of a more complete and more genuinely human personality, not the elimination of shadow material, but its conscious integration into a self, image capacious enough to contain both light and dark, both achievement and cost, both genuine excellence and genuine ordinariness. The person who has done this work is not less impressive than the person who presents only the idealized version of themselves. They are more genuinely impressive, carrying their achievements with a specific quality of grounded completeness that the shadow-free presentation can never quite achieve, because it is always, at some level, a performance, always dependent on the continued suppression of material that is in fact present, and that makes its presence known, eventually and inevitably, through exactly the social dynamics we have been examining. The next time you achieve something real and feel the specific social atmosphere shift in that way you have learned to recognize, try a different orientation than either hurt or defense. Try curiosity. Ask yourself what specific shadow material your achievement is activating in the people around you. Ask yourself what it tells you about their unlived potential and their unacknowledged ambitions. Ask yourself whether there is a genuine tiny flaw in your achievement, a real cost or imperfection that you have been omitting from the presentation, and consider whether including it might serve both your own psychological integrity and the social environment's need for a human-scale version of what you have done. And ask yourself, with the honest self-examination that genuine shadow work requires, whether your own investment in presenting the achievement in idealized form has a shadow dimension of its own, a need to impress, to be recognized, to be seen as exceptional. That is worth acknowledging directly, rather than managing through the polished persona. None of this diminishes what you have accomplished. The work was real. The achievement is genuine. The excellence is yours, and it is worth protecting. But protecting it does not require presenting it in a form so perfect that it activates the collective shadow's need to cut it down. There is a specific freedom available to the person who has genuinely integrated this understanding, and it is worth naming directly because it is qualitatively different from anything that defensiveness or hurt or social maneuvering can produce. It is the freedom of someone who is no longer surprised by the shadow's response to achievement, who receives the pointed comment and the faint cooling of a previously warm relationship without the destabilization that comes from not understanding what they are actually encountering. This person knows what the hostility is made of. They know it is not primarily about them. They know it is the shadow's projection finding its available target. And this knowledge allows them, for the first time, to choose their response from a position of genuine equanimity rather than reactive hurt or defensive withdrawal. This equanimity is not indifference. It is not the performance of not caring. It is the specific, grounded freedom of someone who cares genuinely about their achievement, carries it honestly, including its shadow dimension, and is not dependent on the universal approval of those around them for their sense of its genuine value. That freedom is, in the end, the real protection that Jung's framework offers against the specific social dynamics that visible achievement generates. Not a tactic for managing others' responses, though the tiny flaw technique is a genuinely useful tactic within that, but a genuine psychological orientation toward one's own achievement and one's own shadow that makes the whole dynamic considerably less costly, and the achievement itself considerably more stable than any external management strategy alone could ever produce.